Dr. Nicole Iturriaga. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Planck Institute in Göttingen. I'm a sociologist, so my whole presentation and my work comes from a sociological framework. I also just want to say thank you, Paco, for inviting me and for all of this. This is really nice. So I have a roadmap for today, just so we have an idea where we're going. My basic larger projects, research questions, an overview of the project, today's talk, frameworks, lots of considered academic. Okay, so my research questions for the larger project are how human rights activists are using something I call DE-POLITICIZED forensic science to reframe histories of violence in post-conflict states. So specifically how the activists are using various mechanisms such as performativity, pedagogy, transnational connections to further their goals of restoring identity, memory, and justice within a globalized context. And I come from this, as you know, for those of you who are writing a thesis, there are many theoretical frameworks to pull from. I have a few. One of them is performativity, which is the social movements framework, which is this idea that activists, by performing the change they want to see in society, are actualizing the change that they want to see. So I have an entire chapter in my thesis that focuses on how activists in Spain, specifically with ARMH, the Foundation for Recovery of Historical Memory, use sort of performative actions to engage the public into breaking repressive silences, to talk about the past as a way to actualize the future they want to see in Spain. Pedagogy is another chapter that I have, which focuses on, and this will be the focus of today's talk, forensic and history classes that are conducted for locals who are visiting mass grave exhumations to explain what they're doing, but it's also another way to introduce people to ideas about the rights of families, the need for transitional justice in Spain, and then transnational connections, which I focus a bit on sort of the impact of the ongoing case between Argentina and Spain and what that looks like on the ground with one particular case in Guadalajara. So today's talk, I'm talking, like I said, about the ARMH and how they use this science-forward approach. I argue that by focusing a lot on the science that they're using, the forensic science, the protocols, the DNA testing, that they're able to sort of sidestep delegitimization. So as I'm sure we all know, a good way to try to delegitimize memory activists or human rights activists is to say that they're rabble-rousers or they're trying to destabilize the democracy. And it's not just it's for Spain, it's in many post-conflict countries. You're just trying to open up old wounds. Why you want to destroy what good we have? So this is saying we're not activists, we're not politicians, we're scientists. This is just science. But it's also allowing the introduction of political claims about the rights of families and transitional justice. I'm also arguing in today's talk using two other kinds of theories. This idea of actor network theory, which I think I have a slide on. It's the idea that inanimate objects have agency and can impact how people interact or feel or think about things. And then embodiment is sort of this idea that something becomes tangibly real. So I'm combining those two theories to talk about how victims' remains and personal objects help to connect visitors to the victims and reinforces the power of the narrative that's being expressed by the ARMH in their version of events. So this is bad, there we are. So necropolitics, this is more of today's talk. Necropolitics, we have an expert here. Sort of very generally the use of violent death as a way to maintain control over populations. Collective memory, sort of how we understand the past. Framing, again, coming from social movements theory, this idea of how we understand what's being presented to us, how it's being framed at you, and performativity. actualizing and embodying the change that social movements are fighting for. So I already sort of went through this, but again, embodiment of bodies, embodiment of personal objects are also allowing, I'm arguing that in some cases the bones are actually speaking, but you need the translated voice of the forensic technicians to be able to understand exactly what they're saying. Sort of like you can look at a skeleton and kind of maybe know what's going on, but you're not going to necessarily understand the finesse of the language that the body's telling you unless it's being translated by the forensic technician. So my data here is coming from, all of this is my dissertation. I did a historical analysis between Argentina and Spain. I did fieldwork and interviews in Argentina in 2015, and I did 15 months of ethnographic participant observations with the association between 2015 and 2017. It was a multi-sited grounded theory approach, so I went to many different sites with them. I followed the activists and I went to all of their events. It was in their laboratory, exhumations. I did about 200 informal interviews with non-activist Spaniards, people who came to their events, people who walked by exhumations. And I also did formal interviews with 15 activists and 15 non-activists using a snowball sample. And I also did a discourse analysis of visitor guest books to mass grave exhumations that people signed. So I'm going to quickly go through things you all are experts in. So we'll just go really fast. There was the Spanish Civil War. A lot of people died, even where they didn't meet resistance. And by the end of the war, over 500,000 Spaniards lost their lives. Democracy had fallen. Francisco Franco was in power. Depending on who you ask, it's 120 to 150,000 civilians who died. And then we have Franco, there he is, who penetrated all aspects of life, ensuring any opposition to his rule was destroyed. Fear was deeply institutionalized. There was a ban on publicly mourning the Republican dead. I heard a lot of stories from widows when I was in the field of wanting to leave flowers or commemorations either to be destroyed or it was just too dangerous and they'd have to throw flowers over walls. There's also a very sad story up in Leon of this woman who kept building a monument to her husband who had been killed, and they kept destroying it. And finally, she just threw flower seeds on top of it, so every year lilies pop up as like this perpetual monument that couldn't necessarily be destroyed or seen as a monument. But basically, the dominant narrative here that was set up for almost 40 years is that Franco saved Spain from a Marxist scourge, and the dead were subversives who deserved their death and deserved to continue to stain against them. Up until when he passes in 1975, we have the democratic transition, the passing of the Implacable Olvido. And then here you have the first round of exhumations that are taking place. They're not scientific, but it's a way to sort of get people back, be commemorated. Until the 1981 coup attempt, and it's been explained to me that at this point all of those exhumations stopped out of fear that maybe fascism was coming back. We better to just keep your head down and have it instead of having it chopped off. Again, fear and silence is institutionalized with the transition in that like it's better to leave it in the past idea. Everyone's guilty. Why do we need to talk about it? We're just moving forward. And as I'm sure you all know, this was the model transition. The world was like, this is the way you keep political stability. You just don't ever talk about the past again. Just leave it there, and everything will be fine. And now we're just going to pause 1 second on Spain and pop over to Argentina, which in 1976, a military coup. This was a very tumultuous time in Latin America, overthrew the government of Isabel Perón, who was the third wife of Juan Perón, who died within a matter of weeks of winning his third term. His wife took over. At that point, she was giving this. There was also, like I said, this is a politically tumultuous time period in Argentina. There's a lot of leftist organizations that are doing various bombing, campaign for ransom kind of actions. She gives more power to sort of these military groups to start disappearing people. That gets upped a lot when they take over. The military junta, Vidal is there in the middle. That was one of the main faces of the junta. They believe that Marxism was both biological and curable with right-wing socialization. So not entirely logical there, but that's what led to a lot of these kidnappings of small children was okay, we can't bring them back to the families that produced Marxist parents, but if we raise them in right-wing families, then it's sort of like a long game way of taking out leftists. So during the junta, the number that's given is 30,000 people were disappeared. Around also 5,000 children disappeared, including those who were born in captivity in prisons. The regime fell after their resounding defeat with the British in the Falkland Islands, but also with a mounting pressure by the grandmothers. I am like cutting out so much, so please don't think that this is comprehensive. We get to the transition. There's been a lot of influence of asking Americans to come in with forensic knowledge to help with the transition. A man named Dr. Clyde Snow came to talk about exhumations. At that point, he was most famous for having identified Mengele's remains in Brazil. So he's there, he's giving a conference on exhumations, and somebody asks him, is it possible for a baby bones to evaporate? And he said, no, it's not. Why? And he's like, well, when we went to bury my daughter and her family, they said that the baby was so tender, she just dissolved like water. And he said, would you mind if I do an exhumation just to see what happened here? And basically what the official record said was that this entire family had been killed in a shootout because the parents were militants. But what they found with the forensic evidence was that they had all been executed within about 30 centimeters. This was clearly not a shootout. And the bones that were in the baby's casket were adult bones mixed with like animal bones, and had not, like there had been a decomposition there. So it suggested that perhaps the baby was still alive. This was the beginning of human rights forensics. Dr. Klesno is very famous for saying the bones speak softly, but they never lie. He goes on to found the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, which was the first to do this, and then goes around and globalizes it alongside the grandmothers of Paz de Mayo. Because among some of these exhumations, there are exhumations of female detainees who show pelvic scarring that also provides evidence of live birth. But again, no baby, no fetal remains, suggesting once again that children have been stolen. We have this sort of rise of forensics-based human rights, which these two organizations then go and globalize. Went around and just started teaching everyone how to do this. So Guatemala, Peru, they started a lab in Cyprus. They also done some work in Bosnia. So if you have any more questions on this, I'd be happy to come back to all of this. But now we're just going to pop back to Spain. It's 1998. We have Baltasar Garzón in Pinochet, who is taking a vacation in London, and all of a sudden there's an indictment and a big international, what do we do with this? Eventually he's freed by pretending he has dementia, and they let him go home on the case of sort of humanistic grounds. But this sort of leads the question to like, why is Spain looking at other people's human rights abuses and not their own? Emilio Silva writes an article about his grandfather. This leads to the first scientific exhumation in Spain in 2000. Very prolific, founds the Association for Recovery of Historical Memory. Many other organizations also appear at this time. They're so prolific, we have the Law of Historical Memory, which gave limited state funds for exhumations, declared that all the monuments should be taken down. 2011, we have a change in government that ended these funds. A lot of the sort of civil society groups that had appeared in the early 2000s can't necessarily survive without state funds. The association was able to maintain itself through human rights awards as well as their association fees. And now we have this new change in government, and we'll have to see with time what that actually means. And they will apparently exhume Franco. We'll see. All right. So for those of you who've never been to an exhumation led by this group, at least when I was in the field, people come, I mean, as if you've ever been in a small village in Spain, if there's something new going on, people are interested in what are you doing? But most of the time, if we're in an area that there's a known grave, people already know what we're doing, they're still interested, and they come up. But most people come because they've read about it in a newspaper, or they've heard about it, or they just walk by it. And once there's a critical mass of people, the association leaders will invite them to come and listen to a class about what they're doing. And they always start with explaining their work and how it's based in UN protocols. So the UN protocols, how to exhume forcibly disappeared people, how it's set completely via these protocols, as well as the strict following of forensic anthropology. They explain how you can tell the sex, the age, perimortem, so pre-death injuries versus after-death injuries. And they use the bodies that are in front of the people, because usually at this point, they've been uncovered enough where you can see what's going on. And they use the bodies as example. At the same time, they're also working in the historical data to have a lot of historians who work with them, so they're telling the story of what's known about the victims, how they died, what their names were. If there are a lot of local people there, they tend to jump in with the more gruesome details of the violence because these stories are well known, at least by the older people, about what's with the tools, the painstaking nature of the science, why it's so important to go so slowly, and that also that each of the bones will go through extensive anthropological analysis. So again, there's like this big push on like grounding their work in science and protocols and why that's important. And it's here that they'll start explaining the difficulties about the lack of state support, the lack of a DNA database, the fact that not one Spanish DNA lab was willing to help pay for DNA testing, and at one point they had to do it out of pocket, and that was extremely expensive. I think it was about 500 euros per sample, so it was prohibitively expensive, up until the point that the Argentinian forensic team decided to step in and conduct all of their DNA testing for free, which again is being used also as a way to say we're legitimate in that the most important forensic team in the world is supporting our actions and is doing our DNA testing. We're that professional, we're that recognized. And it's also legitimizing and solidifying their claim that they are this internationally recognized science-based organization as opposed to one that's motivated by politics. So at this point, there's no mention of any sort of political affiliation of anybody working there. And I have this, yeah, so we'll go to the next slide. But yes, so all of it is like grounding in science and international norms that have to be established before they can jump into talking about anything else. But so they continue on with the story, like, so how do people get to gain access to this kind of work? Which they point out that families never pay for anything because they don't believe that they should have to pay for it. It's all free for families. So families gain access by putting in and filling out an enforced disappearance form that's, again, through the United Nations. They go and do archival work, oral testimonies, they talk to locals, trying to understand exactly where to pinpoint this search, because it's actually quite expensive and hard to search for graves that have been there for 80 years. Perhaps the land has changed, there might be a freeway on top of it. So there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done ahead of time to be able to search for these graves. But once they've pinpointed where it is, they'll send people out. And they like to point out that the whole point of this work is so that families have the right to recover their dead, because it shouldn't be up to the killers to decide how they're buried. It should be up to the family members. And this is where we start to see the sort of introduction of more of a political claim, but this is definitely a moral argument of why this work is important, why this should be happening. Everyone has the right to bury their dead. And again, they're pointing out like that they don't think that families should have to pay. It's something they believe that the state should be paying for. However, since they don't, at least at that time, that they were taking over the state's responsibility, and that no burial decisions is made by the association. It's all made by the families, but they do like to provide homage ceremonies. And again, the focus of the families here, on the families, is a long stance of the association that's been criticized by other organizations that felt it was sort of minimizing or whitewashing why these people were in these graves in the first place. But as one of the leaders said, like, why is it, like, everyone knows when we come to these exhumations that these people died for political reasons. Why is it necessary to hammer home the point and potentially run off curious people who are afraid of being associated with red politics? So there is some awareness in the association leadership of sort of minimizing the politics as a way to extend their ability to talk to people. So it's sort of a framing idea here that the association is the venue for the will and agency of the families and not a political organization with political goals. Additionally, it places the emphasis on scientific exhumations as the medium for families and communities to gain closure for these wounds that have never healed, as opposed to a political act that's motivated by anger or revenge or the desire to destabilize a democracy. And it's also, again, connecting the association's work to a larger international human rights idea and framework that families have a human right to recover their missing loved ones, and that victims of state terror have the right to be repatriated with their identities, that nobody has the right to remove someone's identity from their body, and that nobody has the right to deny the family burial rights of their lost loved ones. So after the discussion of technical work, the class leader always segues the attention to any signs of violence or objects. In the grid, this is usually bullets or bullet wounds, and declares that these objects are, quote, clear signs that a crime has taken place, but that it's impossible for any of the families to receive any kind of justice because of the amnesty law of 1977. And they point to signs of violence on the bodies, whether it's like 2 bullet holes or 1 bullet hole. And people are often very drawn to this. I've seen people, older people almost fall in trying to get close to actually see these entry wounds. There's something very visceral about it. And honestly, if you've never seen a mass grave exhumation, it's kind of hard to understand, but it really is just a moment frozen in time. You can very, very easily imagine what happened to these people, because you can just see it in your head how they were thrown in. They're just stuck there in time for you to look at. And in many of my informal interviews with visitors, people would mention like signs of violence as being the true history of Spain. This was the true history. Nobody else didn't need another voice. And one of the women I spoke to said she had heard these stories her whole life, but she had to come and see it herself. She wanted to know exactly what had happened. And even though it was more violent than she anticipated, she still felt that all Spaniards should be forced to go see exhumations because they spoke louder and more honestly than any politician in Spain. Also, this showed up in the guest books for people writing. Maybe they have at the exhumations, they'll have this sort of guest books where people can, I don't know how to, it's like a visitor book. You put in your thoughts. And many of them would talk about these signs of violence as being extremely important. This one, I don't know if you can read it, but she said more or less, I was so impressed to see the skeleton and the cranium with the little bullet hole. What feelings of emotion were running through my body and the tears that were forming in my eyes. I hope that the families can finally receive the news that their loved ones have been found. Another man wrote, it's unbelievably impressive to see the bullet wound in the head. Your work is a moment of light for those who were impoverished by the darkness of the bullet, which is very poetic. But in many ways, these classes are already successful in reframing a historical narrative of violence when they have skeletons doing most of the talking. You don't need to be a forensic expert to look at a bullet hole in someone's head that person was shot to death, right? It's very obvious when you're looking at someone buried alongside a highway with multiple bullet wounds, what happened to that person. And not only that, they become, with this truth that a bullet hole can bring, they become the embodied examples of what state terror looks like against its citizens. It's not necessary to beleaguer the point that these were violent, unjustified deaths when you have the physical remains of someone clearly shot, execution style, and buried alongside a highway. This is also around the time with these signs of violence that the class leader will maybe introduce a more intense critique of the state. But if you notice up until this point, there's really, the harshest thing they said was they should be paying, and there's no asking for an apology. There's no asking for really anything other than just help these poor people recover their remains. But so after talking about signs of violence, they start talking about objects. I've never been to one exhumation that didn't have something of a personal object from someone. There's always something. People have things in their pockets, buttons, things like that. Most of the time, metal or rubber, as they last longer. At one exhumation, there was a woman, this woman, who was found with a red earring and she has a hair comb. She also had a wedding ring on, and it was 4 people, 2 men and 2 women. According to the local testimony, she was 23 years old and 8 months pregnant at the time of her death. And during the class, at this point in this part of Spain, we had around 90 people attending the class. And the class leader said, what kind of threat could this woman possibly have been to justify her execution? How can this violence and this silence, this idea that her story should not be told amongst all the other stories of the victims, that this impunity, this silence could possibly be justifiable? And a different one, the class leader showed the remains of the foot bones of a 15 to 17-year-old boy who died alongside his father. And again, he asked how this violence, this silence, this impunity could be justifiable. And at the point that he showed the shoe, some of the people in the classroom burst into tears. This object is not just visitors. It's also activists who are having these moments of embodiment of people. One of the activists I interviewed was talking about the first exhumation in Guadalajara, and she was talking about being surprised that she didn't feel anything, which is actually pretty common. Some people feel it immediately, some people feel nothing, and she was talking about not feeling anything until she saw a pair of shoes that were worn down in the heel in the same way that her shoes wear down. And she said, it wasn't until that moment that I understood them to be humans who had lives. This person had been walking in the same way that I walk, having a life, and then it was over, taken from them for no reason. She became so overwhelmed after seeing the boot that she had to leave the grave and went into a little shack to compose herself until she could go back and work. Another team member was so impacted by the red earring, he incorporated the image into a tattoo, making his body a permanent locus of potential future teaching moments and an homage to the life of this woman. So it's not just visitors or activists who feel embodiment or embodied loss. At one exhumation in the Galician region, which had a lot of repression, they were doing an exhumation of a tailor who had been extremely brutalized. Before the time of death, he had been interrogated by the local police about the Maquis, the people living in the mountains, and his skeleton spoke to just a very miserable end. Lots of pre-mortem torture-induced fractures, amongst other awful stories. But what was found amongst his remains were these Art Deco cufflinks, which are just, they were so beautiful and such in great shape. And I was talking with his grandson, who up until that point had no idea about his family. It was actually the association that approached this family because they were looking for a different group of men, found this other body. He had no idea his grandfather had been killed because his family had hid this detail out of safety. And then they found that he was buried in this, outside the church. And he said, what a beautiful remembrance to have. What a beautiful way to connect to the grandfather. I can't wait to take these home with me. It's a way to always have him with us. And for him, recovering the remains was a way to get to know his grandfather, a way to understand his family, but also the object, the cufflinks, was a way to have his grandfather with him, even though he never knew him. So my argument here is that objects become embodied with the lives of the dead because they sketch out an outline of a life. It's intensified when the objects are contextualized via these basic historical and forensic facts, and that these objects are also embodying everything that was lost in the cruelty of state terror. Because if you think about it, personal objects, they're so visceral. They tell a story of a life in a very clear and simple way. If a skeleton is wearing shoes made out of the soles of rubber tires, you can sort of imagine the life of a very clever peasant who figured out a way to make shoes that would last. You see a wedding ring that speaks to the existence of a spouse, possibly children, a family life that was left behind. A pair of earrings or a hair comb tells the story of a woman and the kind of fashion style she preferred. And these objects make a story of a life, and it's intensified. You have all of these things happening at the same time for the visitors who are seeing exactly the last moments of someone's life and who they were talking to them. At the very end of the classes, they always open it up to questions, or people want to make statements. Normally it's just sort of a random, like, what are you going to do next? How do you use DNA? All these questions are more or less answered. But oftentimes it's also used by visitors to express different kinds of opinions. In one exhumation that we were at, a village elder who had been to the exhumation every single day got up and said she wanted to thank the team for their tremendous work and to allow them to close this painful chapter in the town. And that was so emotional to see this, and that as the families, so this was an exhumation of 4 Maquis who had died fighting in 1949. So this was a good 10 years after the war. So some of the family members were there. So she specifically turned to them and said, we're sorry that this happened to you, and we're sorry that this was done, and that we're not bad, and we realize you're not bad, and we're really hope that you could have peace now. It was this very intense moment of closure. And one of the family members responded by thanking him and being able, it was an extremely powerful moment. And so in this case, you have an example of where the historical narrative had been, these were a guerrilla Marxist group that was terrorizing people in the mountains and needed to be put down by the state. And now you have a change in the narrative of these were actually victims of state terror, who didn't deserve their fates, and that this was an opportunity to express both sadness and contrition, feelings of guilt, and a way to sort of try and move forward. And both sides felt grateful that they had had this opportunity, and one of the family members was going around and taking pictures with everyone for her family album. And there are other examples where this isn't always the case, but most of the time, question and answer sessions are also a place for people to make political expressions that maybe the association is less likely to claim as their own, but they distance themselves because at that point, it's just about the technical side. The visitors expressing political opinions, that doesn't have anything to do with them. They're just a forum for conversation. All right, so basically, in conclusion, activists are using sort of these pedagogical interventions to introduce various claims: depoliticize science, the right to the family, the need for transitional justice, that work to reclaim the violence of the past, decide steps to legitimization. It also puts them as the translators of the real history of Spain, and that this legitimacy and impact of this reframe narrative is then bolstered by the agency and embodiment of the remains and the personal objects, and that this tactic also works to reclaim the dead as fellow citizens deserving proper burial and care, as founders of Spanish democracy, and also as opposed to being communists deserving of their death and disdain. And that these strategies, and I didn't really get into how this is democratizing the ownership of historical narrative, but there are cases where during these question and answer times where there's a whole conversation about how to understand the past, how to move forward, and who gets to decide that, as opposed from a sort of a top-down state deciding what the narrative is more of a bottom-up. So for my broader dissertation findings, I found that depoliticized forensics-based human rights is a very successful way of sort of, in some cases, seizing state necropower over historical narrative, depending on where you are and what the context is. Obviously not across the board, but it can be a very useful tactic. And that forensics-based human rights are molding transition efforts in terms of how people are restituting the identities of the missing persons and facilitating these important death rituals for victims' families. And then specifically for the Spanish case, so that was sort of like broader conclusions, performative and pedagogical actions. Because you know that in Spain we have a long history of fear and silence. And I didn't really talk about this, but at least in my field work, there were many times where if this topic came up, people would just go silent. No conversation. So in this case, you have to work a lot harder to break long-lasting silences, especially in these little towns. And so by doing these sort of performative and pedagogical actions, you have a way to sort of break open this conversation. You're also actualizing, if that's what you want to break the silence, you're actualizing that action by breaking it yourself. and showing others that it's safe to do so. Plus, you give them a model of how to have these kinds of conversations. In terms of transnational relationships, there's absolutely influence of what's happening on the ground here in Spain and how this is helping develop the pushing for the sovereignty of international forensics-based human rights, which is above that of the state. And you can see that, I think, pretty well in the universal jurisdiction cases. And that's it. Thank you.
We have some minutes to go. We have managed to speak your dissertation.
Sorry if I was talking too much.
Maybe we can also talk in Spanish now, ¿no?
Sí, ya, podemos.
Pues una de las cosas que te quería comentar es, bueno, porque hay un debate entre asociaciones y forenses sobre qué es lo que es forense y lo que no es forense, ¿no? Y me gustaría que dieras la perspectiva, ¿no? Porque tú, me imagino que hablas de René, ¿no? Cuando hablas de Deep Forensic Archaeology, ¿no? Pues ahí los forenses no le consideran forense. Entonces, porque no es médico, no ha hecho medicina legal, no está, y por lo tanto él no puede certificar casos de muerte, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta es, ¿hasta qué punto se puede diferenciar el discurso? O sea, a lo mejor no importa tanto, ¿no? Pero como pones la palabra forense por encima, ¿no? Realmente yo pienso que a lo mejor se puede pensar que la ARMH lo que genera es un conocimiento arqueológico.
Sí,
que es distinto. Entonces no sé cómo ves tú esa tensión, porque es un debate que la ARMH tiene con la Avanzadi, por ejemplo, con el foro, con otros.
Claro, sí, yo sé. En este caso yo creo que porque René siempre dice es un arqueólogo forense, que está poniendo esto primero, sí, es arqueólogo, pero arqueólogo forense. Y luego en sus clases siempre está diciendo, pero luego un antropólogo forense va a hacer más análisis con los cuerpos. En la manera de... Así que él no es, pero otra persona va a hacer más pruebas, más análisis, que está usando los protocolos de Naciones Unidas y todo eso. Es otra manera de decir que somos científicos, pero tenemos otros científicos que tal vez no está aquí ahora, porque no es importante por él estar aquí. Pero en este caso yo creo que la gente que nos están escuchando, no sé, no saben qué es la diferencia. Alguien está explicándolo en una manera que es básico. Esto es un cuerpo femenino, es un cuerpo masculino, es más o menos bastante ciencia por ellos a pensar que esa es como es la ciencia forense. Y yo creo que ese es el punto. Tal vez la gente más técnica sabe la diferencia, pero eso no tiene nada que ver con la gente que está de los pueblos, como, mira, este hombre dice es un arqueólogo forense.
Sí, pero me refiero más bien a tu percepción, ¿no? O sea, que tú hables, digamos, de ciencia forense o sea, ¿cómo ves tú, no la gente de los pueblos, ¿no? O sea,
yo veo que para mí es como si no es exactamente lo mismo con Aranzadi, porque ellos son más de médico, ¿no? Pero yo no veo una diferencia real entre de que las dos organizaciones están haciendo casi lo mismo. Están haciendo las exhumaciones. Tal vez, no sé, de verdad no veo un diferente bastante grave. Para mí están haciendo lo mismo, pero con otra gente en otras partes. No sé qué estoy explicando bien, pero para mí no veo una diferencia. Yo sé que ellos van a decir que no, pero...
Es un debate que está ahí, sobre todo por el tema legal, ¿no?
Claro.
Pero como no hay un paraguas policial tampoco...
Claro. Pero la ARMH me imagino van a decir que están usando los protocolos que podrían usar en el futuro. Así que todo es en la manera judicial. Claro. Pero no sé que es completamente verdad, porque... no quiero decir nada mal, pero no es lo mismo, yo sé, como nosotros como en Bosnia, que están haciendo todo con la policía, pero eso es imposible aquí, por la amnistía. Y tampoco creo que es posible hacer justicia de la misma manera, porque la gente que estaban asesinando a la gente están muertos, es imposible hacer justicia.
sería otra pregunta.
Sí.
Pero bueno, viene a quizás hablar del mismo tema, porque me preguntaba un poco por tu propia percepción o punto de vista sobre lo que llamas la ciencia despolitizada. Al principio ponías comillas, al final desaparecieron, y entonces me gustaría un poco saber cómo lo problematizas y a sabiendas un poco de todos los debates que hay entre asociaciones también, ¿no?
Sí, la palabra de politicized es un poco una broma, porque por supuesto es politizado, ¿sabes? Claro. Es imposible que no es, pero que yo estaba intentando a investigar es cómo están usándolo como es objetivo sin política, porque en Argentina han usado pero de una manera tan perfecta, dice que esta persona se murió con una bala desde 30 centímetros, es imposible, que es como la policía han dicho. Entonces sabemos que ellos están, pues no es la verdad, y ahora podemos saber qué es la verdad real, solo por la ciencia. Y es más difícil decir que la ciencia es falsa, pero en otros casos sabemos, especialmente en mi país, que hay gente que no cree en ciencia del cambio del clima, de las vacunas, pero en muchos casos ya hay muchas investigaciones que están intentando entender por qué la ciencia forense, la gente le crece, no sé qué es por CSI o las series detectivas, pero hay mucha gente que piensa en eso, que han visto en la televisión y piensan es verdad porque han visto, pero como las activistas están usándola es como una baile, ¿sabes? Diciendo que no es política, pero vamos a estar hablando sobre las cosas políticas, pero no somos técnicos, pero aquí es la información, tú eliges, ¿qué piensas? Sí es política, pero estamos solo hablando sobre la ciencia, pero la ciencia llega a otra opinión, ¿sabes qué pasó? En el terror del Estado, que eran víctimas, no eran comunistas, no eran rebeldes, no merecían sus muertes. Es otra manera de hablar sobre el pasado, usando la ciencia a bailar entre estas conversaciones. Pero es una verdad un poco complicada hacerlo bien.
¿Tuviste contacto con el foro en algún momento, el foro por la memoria?
Cuando yo estuve, no, porque no estaban haciendo nada. Durante estos años que yo estuve, no, porque están en el internet solo. Y esa es la otra cosa, que el foro no estaba en este lado, estaban completamente con la política y estaban criticando a ARMH por minimizando las políticas. Pero como yo veo, entre los dos, ARMH más o menos todavía está. Y foro es un voz del internet. Para mí es un ejemplo que una está manejando la cultura y cultura tan tabú un poco mejor, porque están usando manera con la ciencia, que no está hablando sobre la política y existe todavía. La otra, no que es malo, está en el internet, pero no es lo mismo tampoco.
Bueno, lo que pasa es que el foro como que ahora está reorientado a otras luchas contra la impunidad del franquismo y se mueven, o sea, lo que no hacen es exhumación, ¿no?
Claro.
O sea,
Más como activistas por otras cosas.
sí.
Yo te iba a preguntar, dentro de los ejemplos que contabas, es desde una perspectiva de género.
Sí.
Por un lado, como pensar si fue, o sea, en el ejemplo has hablado específicamente de algunas mujeres asesinadas, sí, y has hablado de algunas activistas mujeres de la ARMH. Sí. Un poco cómo habías gestionado, elegido cómo incluir, si habías elegido incluir, es solamente un dato de contar lo que querías encontrar. Y por otro lado, cómo sentías que se construye desde ese discurso despolitizado a las mujeres que estaban en esas fosas, para contarlo en ese espacio.
De hecho, no eran muchas mujeres en las cosas, normalmente son hombres, pero en este caso tenemos dos. Y yo creo que con las cosas de género, también tener una mujer con 8 meses embarazada es mucho más fuerte. Es mujer tan joven, tan vulnerable, que se muere de esa manera es, no sé, otro crimen de los derechos humanos, ¿sabes? Pero sí, el género más o menos, porque también la violencia contra de las mujeres es algo que mucha gente no quiere hablar en mi experiencia. Era como, sí, sí que pasó, pero no vamos a hablar de esto, porque es demasiado, no sé. Pero yo creo que en esta clase, por ejemplo, con la víctima con el pendiente roja, era mucho más impactante para todos, especialmente cuando encontraron los restos de un feto. Ese que impactan bastante. Muchas activistas se fueron a la fosa a llorar, porque era ese algo bastante fuerte. Pero ahora no recuerdo exactamente qué era tu pregunta.
Si habías elegido hablar específicamente...
Sí, yo creo que solo porque era tan fuerte, tan impactante y también es un muy buen ejemplo de poder de los objetos, ¿sabes? En el pendiente, y que ahora es un parte del tatuaje de alguien, y que también mucha gente tenía mucho interés en esa mujer, porque también solo era una pendiente, la otra no pudimos encontrar. Es que también hay otro señal de violencia donde se fue. Y también con la piñeta, el anillo, todo es muy fácil ver la vida de esa mujer. La única vez que he usado esto es porque es un muy buen ejemplo. Y también la activista, es solo porque esta persona han dicho de una manera bastante perfecta. Es la versión que he usado.
¿Qué impacto, cuando tú, por ejemplo, hablas de esto en Estados Unidos, qué recepción tienes? O sea, la gente con la que interaccionas, ¿no? Que no es lo mismo aquí, que más o menos nos conocemos el tema.
No, la mayoría es como, ¿era una dictadura en España? Esa es la primera reacción. Y como, sí, por muchos años. Pero sí, la reacción casi siempre es algo impactante a escuchar historias de violencia en Europa, que no es conocido en mi país, que mucha gente no sabe nada de España antes de Playa Sol, ¿sabes? Nada más. Así que a saber que hay cosas más como solo a Camboya, es algo bastante fuerte a pensar que un país de Europa podría tener este tipo de historia, que también más o menos la gente tenga mucho interés a saber más. Los americanos tengan attention span un poco cortito.
¿Tienes más cuestiones o seguimos hablando ahora mientras... ¿Te puedes quedar a comer, Nicole?
Gracias.
Pues nada, muchas gracias por venir y por presentarnos tu tesis. Y, bueno,
Gracias por venir.
te iba a presentar al principio, pero cuando presentaste tú solo. Pues nada, ya la siguiente es
el 13 de diciembre, a las 12, el jueves 13 de diciembre, viene Ram Natarajan a hablarnos sobre los juicios de lesa humanidad en Argentina y la exposición que ahora se llama Las violencias de la sala.
Sí, porque ha hecho etnografía dentro de...
Está trabajando, yo creo que en Córdoba y en Buenos Aires.
Muy bien, ya no estás aquí, pero bueno, lo tendremos online.
Bueno, gracias.
Muy bien, gracias, Nicole.
Gracias.